Hello, class. Today I'm sharing a lecture I call Discipleship Fit. Uh, we are we're engaged in a conversation here, a topic of conversation about the various ways different churches, different ministries illustrate discipleship. Have you noticed that it seems like every different church, every different ministry will have their own view of how discipleship is done? Whether it's in a Sunday school class or it's done in small groups, whether it's one on one accountability partners, or if the focus is simply in a large group gathering. You add to the mix the growing role of missional communities in many different ministries, and suddenly you got this push and pull of uh, of definitions of discipleship, arguments that brew, and many people saying this is the only way it's done. And so today we're going to take a look at this mostly from about a 10,000 foot view, uh, but in certain areas I'll get a little bit deeper. The way that we're dealing with this in the class is Bobby Harrington and Alex Absalom's book, Discipleship That Fits. Now, this is a unique book because they are looking at the types of relationships that God uses to help us grow to become more like Jesus, which is a great thing, and this needs to happen. And this unique book does something that tries to assimilate all those other perspectives into a workable model that honors each of them. And I think they do a really good job of that. There are some drawbacks to this book, but for the most part, I think they're on the right track. Uh, Bobby Harrington and Alex Absalom lead a ministry called discipleship.org. They have all kinds of discipleship resources and such for sale and some for free online. I highly encourage you to check them out. I don't endorse all their products 100%, but I have used many and I feel strongly about their value. At the core, this book talks about 5 kinds of discipling relationships: the public context, the social context, personal context, transparent context, and the divine context. Obviously, when you're starting with the public, you're talking about relationships in a much wider gathering, getting all the way down to the intimate relationship that we have with God. What I don't appreciate about this book, the major problem I see, is that I think that this list is focused on exactly backwards. Now, I know Bobby Harrington. I don't know Alex Absalom, but I do know Bobby Harrington. And I would say that some of the aspects of the way this list comes about were not intended in his view. But the way the book can be read is, that this is a sequence of importance, or that we need to start in number one and work our way to number five, or something like that. I don't think that's his intent, but it does, in my reading it now 3 times, uh, I think that that is an unintended consequence. So, for the purpose of this lecture, I'm going to flip that script a bit, and you'll see why here in a minute. The motivation for that actually comes from Bobby Harrington himself. In the book, he says, in order to bear fruit as we follow Jesus, we need to grasp the centrality of discipleship as imitation. And that is exactly right. Paul, on multiple occasions, says, imitate me as I imitate Jesus. He's setting himself apart as, I'm somebody to look at as more mature in their faith. I've been following Jesus longer and have been set apart for this purpose. You can trust that if you begin to put into practice the things that I'm doing, that you will grow in your faith. You will grow in your relationship with Jesus. That's great. However, Paul himself also writes in Ephesians chapter 5 verse 1, be imitators of God as dearly loved children, which I believe actually trumps even the imitating Paul. We're called to imitate Jesus himself. And then, yes, give it context through the imitation of a disciple or somebody who's along the journey with us. But we need to be really careful. We are not saved by the church. We are not saved, uh, and we don't have a relationship with Jesus that only looks like the church. we can have a relationship with Jesus that is unique and one on one, and then every aspect of our life is informed and guided by the give and take relationship, the conversational relationship, the journaling and reading relationship, the solitude and silence breaking way into community, and do that with Jesus. And so that's where I want you to keep in mind as you read this book. You're supposed to give a response to this book at the end of this month, and so this lecture I hope will give you some context of how I approach it. I still think it's of great value. I just think that in this aspect we want to keep the main thing the main thing, and the main thing is our relationship with Jesus. We actually have talked about this quite a bit in the discussion of the wagon wheel. Uh, Harrington and Absalom talk about it as the divine context. I like the wagon wheel because the most important part of the wheel is the hub. The spokes are the relationships, the connectivity that connect the hub to the wheel so it functions. And the outer wheel itself, that's ministry, that's life, that's where serving Jesus in community takes place. And so the divine context informs and shapes every other relationship. So beginning there just makes sense. This is where your journaling and reviewing your journal and your prayer time and time in the Word and time just sitting quietly with Jesus is so important. And allowing Jesus to help guide your reality. This morning, I was actually really frustrated with something. I went to bed last night really upset about something where I felt lied to by someone, and this morning I got up and it came to mind again, and it just overcame me. I was having a hard time focusing, so I opened my journal and I just poured out those emotions to God. I knew I needed to get this lecture out, but I couldn't. And so I poured out those emotions to God and I said, Lord, I know you don't want anger and frustration to define me. So help me conquer this. And he did. He did. God does not let anger and frustration with us define him or with anybody. So uh, he invites us to imitate him in that. And so I did this morning, and I'm not always successful in that, but today I was able to then move past it and start working on things that God did want me to work on. And that's where that whole imitation of God, starting in the divine context, it helps us engage others when we keep Jesus as our hub. Now, the next context is the transparent context. I prefer to call this spiritual friendship. This is people walking together following Jesus. And this is going to be a conversation between friends where you share a lot. This is more intimate, where hopes, fears, dreams, brokenness can be here. Now, some will say, well, shouldn't that just be your spouse? Well, maybe not. I mean, honestly, this there is a role where having as a man another man that I can speak to, be able to respond is really important, and can share that with other people, and have them speak into my life. Or other really good friends who know me well. I have a writing partner. She's a professor at Central, Sherry Tessar, and we have worked together for 9 years. And so there's an aspect of our friendship that really fits this. Um, and it's because of that shared journey that we've had. This obviously doesn't take the place or impede on that relationship with one's spouse, but it's something I just want you to be aware of. To have this level of friendship is not something you have a ton of. This is Jesus with Peter, James, and John. This is they're welcomed in to his group, and he pours into them, right? Jesus had his divine relationship where he would go away with solitude, in silence, and just be with his Father. But then He had those three that he shared moments like the Transfiguration, where they got to see a little bit further beyond the veil. And who do you let beyond the veil of your own heart and your own mind, or the facade that oftentimes the world sees, even if it's unintentional? We need those people in our life to challenge us, to also encourage us and remind us how God affirms us, and say, no, you are beloved of God. Don't be so hard on yourself. Yes, you've sinned. Yes, you've broken a promise, or you've hurt me, or you've done this, but forgiveness can define this relationship. We all need that, but it requires us to be transparent with somebody. Uh, and that requires intense spiritual maturity, not responding out of just self centeredness, self protection, but instead lowering our guard and allowing ourselves to truly love one another as Jesus did. And that is a self sacrificing love. The personal context, small groups. I think a lot of times we have heard that small groups are where uh, that intimate bond should be, but really that you can't have that many intimate friendships. There can be very close small groups. I've had some, but generally it's it it's something that develops over time. These will be closer friendships though, and they become the context oftentimes. We're out of the small groups, the transparent relationships, the deep spiritual friendships really develop. It provides a context for that. Well, an example would be Jesus and the 12. And out of his small group, his people that there are going through life together, he had Peter, James, and John, his three, that he let come deeper with him. And here you're getting to know each other, you're in each other's space, you're able to share, and relationships can be developed. There's probably a Bible study element at this point, that it may be the focus oftentimes in a ministry or something, but it could be a prayer group. It could be that this group meets for more of a Christian social context just to develop friendships, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that. Oftentimes, churches, ministries will set these up based on station in life type groups. Other organizations, such as Celebrate Recovery, have this type of group that is really centered on the struggles that we face, and helping people journey together and encourage one another through and that's a wonderful resource that can be used, and it's not wrong. Here we can see how other people follow Jesus, maybe not as closely as the intimate relationship, but you can begin to get a glimpse of it. The social context. Now, the social context is generally defined in sociological circles as between 20 and 50, or 20 and 70 people, depending upon, whose literature you're reading. And the social context is really like the size of a small church, or what's happening in more urban and suburban areas, missional communities. Um, these are people that are united for a specific purpose to serve Jesus. Missional communities sometimes are an offset of a church, like they are the outreaching purpose of the church. And so I have a friend of mine. His name is Todd Vogt. He is the executive director of Mission Alive. They are an organic missional church planting organization. And what they do is they don't focus on gathering a whole bunch of people and then launching the church. What they do is they train church planters to go and get to know the community, find the needs in the community that Jesus wants to do something about, and then find people that are interested in addressing those needs to be on mission with God. And some of them may be Christians and some of them won't. But in the context of meeting those needs, begin to share Jesus and see how the Holy Spirit then moves the church, because what comes out of that is the church. So rather than building the church, Mission Alive teaches, similar to Mike Breen in his book Building a Discipling Culture, they focus on building disciples who are on mission with God. Uh, what happens is that the common goals become fabric for relationships to build, and in those, people start to get a glimpse of what it is to follow Jesus, and it gives them opportunities to start to see how they could be involved in a small group, or they could begin to develop intimate relationships that help them develop the divine relationship. And so you're starting to see how these intertwine. Um, this tends to be about the size where you see a lot of activity of beginnings of relationships. Uh, it's typical not in a small group setting. You add somebody to the small group, and at least in the first few meetings, there's a bit of a forced, I've got to get to know these people before I can trust. Well, here in the social context, because you're part of a bigger group, it's a little less intimidating to become the new person in it, and it's there. The entry point is less intimidating. So what tends to happen is social contexts that have a very specified mission and everybody's on board going towards that tend to work really well. Now, on the other hand, small churches that have been around for a long time that are at that size don't have uh, that ease a lot of times, and that's because they've been that size, and they've oftentimes had focus in a lot of different areas, and it's harder to pinpoint. Okay, where do I step into this? That missionally focused social context makes it very easy to ask the question: do I belong here? Am I about that mission? Am I interested in seeing the needs of the homeless met, or am I interested in helping this organization that's focused on ministering to autistic kids and their families? I've seen a wide range of missional communities develop, and it's really neat because people who have no interest in a relationship with God can be drawn to the cause, and then in the midst of serving, they're confronted with the fact that Jesus is the way that happens. And I've seen many people come to Jesus because of this. Not always, but it's pretty exciting. But in the missional community, unlike a church, there are fewer rules about who can be involved and who can't. It's much more fluid. The leaders of the missional communities just have to always be very upfront. We do this because we're serving Jesus. We do this as an expression of Jesus' love. We do this because, and people have the choice to join or not. And anyway, that's one of the unique things about that aspect. I find that interesting about Jesus too. He rarely was defining what people who were walking with him, literally in the dirt, what they had to believe in that moment. Instead, he taught them what he believed, what he knew to be true, and invited them to consider it. And over time, they would wrestle with it. And sometimes they walked away. Saddest verse in the Bible is John 6:66. John chapter 6, verse 66. Go look it up. But on the other hand, in the following verses, he turns to his apostles and said, "What about you? Are you going to leave?" And they say, "No, where else would we go?" So some will leave, but many will stay, and many will be excited about what the truth of Jesus has held. And the social context allows for a very non threatening way for that invitation and challenge to take place. Now, the public context is probably the most known when it comes to the church, but we oftentimes don't think of large church gatherings uh, to be disciple. We don't think of them as discipleship, but they are important elements of discipleship. There is a relationship. Any preacher will tell you that there is a relationship between them and their congregation, them and the listeners. Now, it's more of a one-sided conversation. It's It's not providing the atmosphere for feedback from the church itself. And that's hard, I can tell you. But leaders of larger churches wrestle with that a lot. But if they're smart, they will understand that that is not the primary tool of discipleship. It is often, in the last 200 years, the primary tool of evangelism. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily right, but we tend to follow a revivalist model where we sing a few songs, we have a sermon, which is oftentimes a plea, come to Jesus, and then there is an invitation, and so we call that evangelism. That's actually revivalism. Evangelism is sharing your faith in any context. And actually, while there have been great crusades and revivals and such, the large group gathering is more of an opportunity to be part of the greater gathering and experience the enthusiasm, the joy, sometimes the lament. We don't do that very well in this country, but sometimes it's good to mourn and be sad together when something isn't good. Right now, as I'm recording this, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 season. This is a time of mourning. There's been a lot of death and sadness, but we can look at the Psalms together in large groups and even small groups and say, we look to the Psalms, we see the Psalms of lament, and they express anguish and pain and suffering, but together we can help each other turn to God and say, yeah, but you've conquered bigger things than this, and you're going to do it again. And we look forward to you arriving and changing this. So you see, each of these contexts has a purpose in encouraging us to follow Jesus, giving us an element of experiencing our Lord and to imitate him. But I think it is one of the small flaws in the book that he just goes in the wrong order, in my opinion. Now, I think Absalom and Harrington would say, well, we're building up to the big event, and the big event truly is not the public context. If that's their mindset, then the big event really is your relationship with God. But it's the big event, but it's also the starting place where the relationship with Jesus informs and shapes every other relationship. I hope that you enjoy this book. I look forward to reading your white papers on it and your thought process about it, about discipleship that fits. And it's one of the last couple of assignments we have in the class. God bless you. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.